Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And here, right here, come here, dear, is Mildred. No, Finster, pardon me. There's Finster. There's Finster. Hello, Finster. You know, cats are quite trainable. You just give them food when they do what you want them to, and they will do what you want them to, whether you want them to or not. The hard part is getting them to do what you don't want them to. That's a bigger issue. But Finster is up here constantly hanging out while I'm doing this, stomping on my computer and sort of, blocking the light and doing all that stuff. She's really quite a character. Mildred is underfoot, but you've seen her too now. So let me just put her down. There you go, girl. Thank you. And we shall continue with the topic. What was the topic? Oh, I remember. Yes. Why don't people play Tchaikovsky's endings the way Tchaikovsky wrote them? This is something that has been troubling me for centuries as a percussionist, because I'm usually involved in the ending of Tchaikovsky's symphonies and tone poems. And, it's a craziness. It's an aspect of our association with this composer. It could be because he has a reputation of maybe not being formally all that fluent. I don't really understand it. But the fact is, it's open season on Tchaikovsky. Think about it. There used to be cuts in the finale of the Fifth Symphony. Now we normally play it complete. There were cuts in the first movement of the Violin Concerto, cuts all over the Second Piano Concerto. I mean, people doodle his forms. The Manfred Symphony, people added and subtracted and reorchestrated. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. And nowhere is tinkering more evident than in the handling of percussion parts, because conductors seem to think that the noise department is fair game. I mean, Tchaikovsky, my goodness, he couldn't do anything without an extra tam-tam crescendo or some sort of insanity going on. Adding, subtracting, they all did it. Leonard Bernstein added a few cymbal crashes to the finale of the Fourth Symphony. Some people take them away, some people add them. There's always something going on in Tchaikovsky. But one of the things that has always annoyed me is Tchaikovsky was incredibly detailed in his score indications. He really was. He organized his parts very, very carefully. For example, his dynamic range is completely insane. It goes from like 6 P's, pianissimo, to 5 F's, fortissimo, with every gradation in between. And he always is careful to indicate whether tremolos are measured or not in his string parts. String tremolos, where you're just going chicka, 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 like this. And they can be just a rhythmless buzzing, or they can be actual notes in time. Tchaikovsky always lets you know what he wants by how many lines he sticks under the notes. He always makes sure that if he wants an unmeasured tremolo, he makes it so tiny in note values, depending on what the key signature is, that you have no choice. If you play it the way he wrote it, you're going to get what he wanted. And that's also true of his timpani parts. And this is where the ending situation comes in, because Tchaikovsky has 2 basic endings in those sort of classic tonic and dominant formulations. Bum, 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 timpani roll, yum, yum, timpani roll, yum, but with the unison at the end, right? I'm going to play you some samples so you don't have to listen to me sing them, thank God, because you have to hear it and see what I mean. But Tchaikovsky basically does it 2 ways. There are endings where that big unison, da-da, the last note is without timpani and percussion, and those where the timpani keep rolling right through the end. But conductors seem to feel free to screw with it however they want. And most commonly what they do is they keep the timpani rolling straight through the end. But it's a very different sound, a very, very different sound. When you cut off the percussion and just have the unison, it's a very final stop. I mean, it really stops the piece completely. And if you let it keep going, keep rolling on through the end, because it's been rolling all along for that last chord, there's a sense of increased energy and continuity almost past the end of the work. It's a very different energy. They're both final. I mean, the ending is clearly the ending. We're not confused about where we are. But the level of tension and the sense of finality is extremely different. And it's important, I think, to do it the way Tchaikovsky wrote it, because he really knew what he was doing. I mean, if he takes the pain to make those kinds of distinctions, we should observe them because they mean something. They meant something to him. And everybody is guilty, just about. There are some conductors who actually play what Tchaikovsky wrote, and it's very interesting when they do. And let me give you some samples, just to be absolutely clear. First, let's see. Well, we're going to do this. I think we'll do it this way. I thank God that I have permission to use samples on Vox, because they're now owned by Naxos, and this is the Maurice Abravanel Tchaikovsky cycle, which is actually quite good for the most part, and it also has a bunch of tone poems. So we're going to talk about tone poems. When it comes to symphonies, the same situation applies. And you could look at the scores on IMSLP or one of those websites and see for yourself what Tchaikovsky actually wrote. But let's start with the most obvious one, Romeo and Juliet, because Romeo and Juliet has a coda, a totally separate coda, which is based on a timpani roll. I mean, it fades away to nothing, then the timpani make this big roll, and then they just do some final chords. Da-dum, bum, da-da-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum. And the timpani cut off. They're supposed to cut off. They don't always cut off. There are some performances where they do not. But let us listen to that ending, and you'll hear exactly what I mean. See? No question about it, right? The timpani cut off and you have bottom, and it really stops the music. It stops the music dead in its tracks. I have another example here, the 1812 Overture. Now that's one where the temptation to keep everybody roaring away is almost irresistible, isn't it? You know, it's you know, the snare drum's going, the timpani are going, sometimes a bass drum is going. You know, they could keep the cannons and the bells going if they had the opportunity. I don't think anyone's been that nervy yet, but yeah, they could. So let's listen to the end of the 1812 Overture the way Tchaikovsky wrote it. Yeah, that was Maurice Abravanel and the Utah Symphony playing Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture the way Tchaikovsky really wanted it done. Actually, Leonard Bernstein does it that way too. I mean, famous conductors, sometimes they pay attention. As often as not, they don't, because they think, falsely in my view, that it's more exciting to make a huge crescendo of something, of noise, up to the very end. That was Tchaikovsky, who would probably add a tam-tam crescendo there, like he does sometimes at the end of Francesca da Rimini, which we'll get to in a moment. So it's much better to do what Tchaikovsky wrote musically, I think. This is not a deal breaker. This isn't one of those tiny details where you say, oh, I hate this performance because they let the timpani roll to the end. No, if the rest of the performance is fabulous, I can deal with it. I mean, we're not going to jump up and down and scream and object, but it's still worth noting. Now, let's listen to an example of Tchaikovsky where he keeps everything going up till the end. And you'll hear the difference in energy level, the difference in the feeling of movement through the final bar. One absolutely is a firm stop, and the other is an exciting culmination all the way up to the last bar, designed to raise you up out of your seat, kind of. And that's, for example, in this case, the March Slav. The March Slav ends with everybody still rolling away. Here's the end. You see? You see what the difference is? The difference in that feeling of tension, in that feeling of motion. One is a complete stop, like I said. The other is a provisional stop, if you want to call it that. The Fourth Symphony ends with the timpani rolling all the way through, for example. The second does not. And it's a question of how these people decide to mess with Tchaikovsky's scores that determines what we're actually going to get. Now, there is one very interesting last example I want to play for you, which is the end of Francesca da Rimini. Now, that's a piece where the temptation to keep things going or even add something is almost irresistible. It's like the 1812 overture, because that ending is you've got a timpani roll, you've got a bass drum, you've got cymbals, you've got a tam-tam, a gong going whack, 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 whack. And it's supposed to be hell and sulfurous flames. And I mean, there's no limit to what you can do. And probably, 9 out of 10 performances ignore what Tchaikovsky actually wrote. But what he wrote was quite similar to the ending of the 1812 overture and Romeo and Juliet. Only here, the timpani actually makes a decrescendo. It begins loudly and then just dies out underneath, so that unison in the rest of the orchestra that stops the movement emerges from the hubbub, from the welter of sound. And I understand people just want to keep it rolling, but it's a very subtle effect. And it's, conductors or geniuses particularly, and take pains at these things, how things end, and these subtleties and details, they ought to be observed. I still believe that. So here is Abravanel in Utah doing the end of Francesca, and you'll hear that timpani make a decrescendo and the unison emerge from it, and it's very effective the way Tchaikovsky wrote it. Isn't it? Doesn't that work really well? I think it works supremely well. So, you'll probably very seldom hear it done that way. I think Markevich does it that way too. He's very good with those things. He's a detail guy because he was a composer, and so he respects other composers most of the time anyway. So this was just a little chat. I wanted you to know what Tchaikovsky really wrote. So now you can run off to your collections and listen to your dozens of performances of these works and see who does it and who doesn't, and how you feel about it. Whether you would prefer that they do what Tchaikovsky wanted, or whether you like it better when they don't do what Tchaikovsky wanted. I understand the desire to be superficially exciting. And like I said, if the performance is just hair-raising, hell for leather, that's, for example, like Svetlanov or somebody like that in his later recordings, you can't argue with it, right? Because it's just so exciting. It's so crazy. It's like, what the hell? But there's nothing worse, in my view, than adding something to create superficial excitement to a performance that is otherwise boring as hell. It's totally, one of the classic examples of that is Andrei Previn's recording of Tchaikovsky's Manfred Symphony, which is the dullest performance of the Manfred Symphony I ever heard in my life. And he adds tam-tam crashes to the end of the first movement. So did Toscanini. A lot of people do it that way. It's wrong. Totally wrong. But Previn does it, and it's like, I mean, it's absolutely painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. It's practically Dadaist because it's such a dreary performance otherwise. So why this effort all of a sudden at the very end to be exciting? I mean, it's insulting. It's insulting to us as listeners. And sometimes that's what happens with these people. They have no ideas. They have no concept of how the music should go. They couldn't be exciting if their lives depended on it, but they think that little old me, the timpanist at the end, is going to somehow redeem their completely droopy and brain dead interpretation. That's what's really irritating. So I hope this gives you a little insight into this is one of those tiny little details, one of the highways and byways of the classical music world. But it's one of those things that everybody does, everybody tinkers, and you know better now. And you know where to look, and you know what to look for. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.